Look at Tokyo today. Robots serve coffee in cafes. Bullet trains glide between cities at nearly 200 miles an hour, arriving within seconds of their scheduled time. Video games, anime, and cars designed here are consumed and driven on every continent on Earth. Japan is one of the most technologically advanced nations in human history, and here's what makes that remarkable. Twice in the last 170 years, this country was brought to its absolute knees. Twice, it rebuilt itself into one of the most powerful nations on the planet. No other country in the modern era has done that, not once, but twice. So this isn't really a story about rising, it's a story about what happens when a nation is forced to reinvent itself completely, not once, but again and again. And to understand how, you have to go back long before any of that, to an island nation that spent centuries developing almost entirely on its own terms. Japan's recorded history stretches back well over 1,000 years before any of this. An imperial line tracing its roots to at least the 6th century ruled from the ancient capital, first at Nara and later at Kyoto, presiding over a refined court culture that produced remarkable art, poetry, and literature, including what many consider the world's first novel, The Tale of Genji, written by a noblewoman named Murasaki Shikabu around the year 1000. But real political power gradually slipped away from that imperial court and into the hands of regional warrior clans. By the late 1100s, Japan had developed a distinct system of military rule, headed by a shogun, a supreme military commander who held actual governing power, while the emperor remained a revered but largely ceremonial figurehead, a split between symbolic and practical authority that would define Japanese politics for the next 700 years. This was the era that gave rise to the samurai, a warrior class bound by codes of loyalty and honor, serving regional lords called daimyo, who controlled their own territories much like feudal barons in medieval Europe. For centuries, power shifted between shogunates and rival clans, but by the mid-1400s, that balance collapsed entirely. A devastating conflict known as the Onin War fractured central authority, and Japan spiraled into what became known as the Sengoku period, the Age of Warring States, roughly a century and a half of near-constant civil war between rival daimyo, each fighting to expand their territory at their neighbor's expense. If you were a peasant farmer in central Japan during the 1500s, your rice fields might change hands between warring lords several times in your lifetime, with little say in who ruled you or why. Out of that chaos, 3 successive warlords, Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and finally Tokugawa Ieyasu, fought, schemed, and allied their way toward reunifying the country, a process that took decades and culminated in the year 1600 when Tokugawa Ieyasu won a decisive victory at the Battle of Sekigahara, effectively ending the age of civil war. Rewind then to the year 1603. Tokugawa Ieyasu formally became shogun, cementing his family's rule and founding what would become known as the Tokugawa shogunate. By this point, Japan had already had its first real taste of contact with the West. Portuguese traders had arrived by ship in 1543, the first Europeans to reach Japan, bringing with them firearms that would soon transform Japanese warfare. Just a few years later, in 1549, a Portuguese-sponsored Jesuit missionary named Francis Xavier landed in Japan and began preaching Christianity. Over the following decades, Portuguese traders and Catholic missionaries, soon joined by the Spanish, and eventually Protestant traders from the Netherlands and England, expanded their presence in Japan, and Christianity spread surprisingly quickly, converting hundreds of thousands of Japanese people, including some regional lords who saw conversion as a way to secure access to Portuguese trade and firearms. If you were a Japanese lord in the late 1500s watching Portuguese ships arrive loaded with muskets and Jesuit missionaries in the same breath, trade and religion looked like two sides of the same foreign influence arriving together, and having finally achieved peace after over a century of civil war, the Tokugawa government came to see that spreading foreign religion backed by foreign trading powers, as a serious threat to its own authority and to Japan's stability. So it made a decision that would define the country for generations. It would seal itself off, starting in the 1610s and hardening through the 1630s. Japan enforced a policy known as Sakoku, meaning closed country. Christianity was violently suppressed, with tens of thousands of Japanese Christians killed or forced to renounce their faith in the decades that followed. Foreign trade was restricted to a tiny handful of controlled ports, with only the Dutch, stripped of any missionary ambitions, permitted a small continued trading presence. Japanese citizens were forbidden from leaving, and foreigners were largely forbidden from entering. For roughly 250 years, while Europe industrialized, while steam engines and factories and modern militaries transformed the West, Japan remained a feudal, agrarian society, governed by samurai and rice farmers, almost entirely cut off from the outside world. If you were a farmer in rural Japan in the early 1800s, your entire universe was your village, your rice paddies, and a government that had not meaningfully changed in 2 centuries. The rest of the world, as far as you knew, barely existed. That isolation felt permanent. It was not. On July 8, 1853, 4 American warships appeared in Tokyo Bay. They were commanded by an American naval officer named Commodore Perry, and they were unlike anything the Japanese had ever seen. Black steam-powered hulls, belching smoke, bristling with cannons. The Japanese called them the Black Ships. Perry had come with a blunt demand from the American government: open Japan's ports to trade or face the consequences. Imagine you're a Japanese official standing on the shore that day, watching these smoke-belching iron monsters anchor in your harbor, armed with weapons your 250-year-old feudal military had no answer for. The Tokugawa government, humiliated and outgunned, had no real choice. Within a year, Japan signed a treaty opening select ports to American trade, the first of what would become a series of unequal treaties forced on Japan by Western powers. For a country that had spent 2.5 centuries insisting the outside world could simply be locked out, this was a profound shock. And it broke something. Within Japan, a growing faction of samurai and reformers looked at what had happened and drew a brutal conclusion. Isolation had made Japan weak. If Japan didn't modernize, and fast, it would be carved up by Western powers exactly like China was being carved up at the very same time. In 1868, that faction won. The Tokugawa shogunate, which had ruled for over 2.5 centuries, was overthrown, and a young emperor was restored to symbolic power in what became known as the Meiji Restoration. What followed was one of the fastest, most deliberate transformations any nation has ever attempted. The new Meiji government sent officials abroad to study Western industry, science, and government, then raced to import and adapt everything they learned. Railways were built, a modern conscript army and navy were created, modeled on European militaries. Factories rose, a constitution was written, universal education was introduced. In barely a generation, Japan went from a closed feudal society to an industrializing modern state, and it did this specifically to avoid the fate of its neighbors. If you were a young samurai in the 1870s, watching your entire social class formally abolished almost overnight, so that Japan could build a modern conscript army instead, you were watching your own country dismantle itself in order to survive. And the strategy worked with terrifying speed. In 1894 and 1895, Japan defeated China in a war and seized Taiwan. Then, in 1904 and 1905, it did something that stunned the entire world. It defeated Russia, a major European power, in the Russo-Japanese War, becoming the first Asian nation in the modern era to defeat a Western power in a major conflict. 52 years after Commodore Perry's Black Ships forced Japan open at gunpoint, Japan had become a power the West had to take seriously. The rise had happened almost impossibly fast, but rises built that fast on that much momentum don't always know when to stop. Over the following decades, Japan's success curdled into something more dangerous. Confidence in its own military strength, combined with a shortage of natural resources and a hunger for territory and raw materials, pushed Japan toward increasingly aggressive imperial expansion across Asia. In 1910, Japan formally annexed Korea, ruling it as a colony for the next 35 years. Korean language education was suppressed. Korean industry was restructured to serve Japanese economic interests, and Koreans were pressured to adopt Japanese names and customs. Taiwan, seized decades earlier, was governed the same way, run as an extractive colonial possession rather than a partner. In 1931, Japan's military engineered a pretext to invade Manchuria in northeastern China and installed a puppet state there. And in 1937, Japan launched a full-scale invasion of China itself, a war marked by immense brutality, including the Nanjing Massacre, in which Japanese forces killed a staggering number of civilians and prisoners of war in the city of Nanjing over a period of weeks. If you were a civilian anywhere in occupied China, Korea, or the territories Japan would soon seize across Southeast Asia, occupation meant forced labor, suppressed culture, and for many, direct violence. This was not a benevolent expansion. It was empire building through conquest, and it left deep, lasting scars across the region that still shape diplomatic tensions in East Asia today. As war spread across Europe in 1939, Japan aligned itself with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, forming the Axis powers. Seeking the oil, rubber, and resources it lacked at home, Japan pushed further into Southeast Asia, occupying French Indochina and setting its sights on British, Dutch, and American territories across the Pacific. The United States responded with escalating trade embargoes, especially on oil, which Japan's military desperately needed to continue its campaigns. Japan's leadership, unwilling to withdraw from China and unwilling to accept being strangled economically, made a fateful gamble. On December 7th, 1941, Japanese forces launched a surprise attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, pulling the United States directly into World War II. In the months that followed, Japan moved with stunning speed, seizing the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, Burma, and the Dutch East Indies, building an empire that at its height stretched across a vast swath of the Pacific and East Asia. For a brief period, it looked as though Japan's second great expansion might succeed where its ambitions had been building for decades. It did not last. What followed was catastrophic for Japan. American forces, recovering from the initial shock of Pearl Harbor, began pushing back island by island across the Pacific in brutal, costly fighting at places like Midway, Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. As American forces drew closer to the Japanese home islands, American bombing raids began systematically leveling Japanese cities. A single firebombing raid on Tokyo in March 1945 killed well over 100,000 people in a single night, one of the deadliest bombing raids in human history. And then, in August 1945, the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the only nuclear weapons ever used in war, killing well over 100,000 people, many instantly, many more in the months that followed from injuries and radiation. If you were a civilian in Hiroshima that August morning, you had no warning, no way to comprehend what was about to happen to your city in a single flash. On August 15th, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a radio broadcast, the first time most Japanese citizens had ever heard their emperor's voice. The nation that had built an empire across Asia in barely 50 years now lay in ruins, its cities firebombed and irradiated, its military dismantled, its economy shattered, and the territories it had conquered liberated from its control. The first rise was over, and it had ended about as badly and as destructively for millions of people across the region as a rise possibly could. What happened next is, in some ways, even more remarkable than the first transformation. American forces occupied Japan, and under the direction of General Douglas MacArthur, oversaw a sweeping reconstruction of Japanese society. A new constitution was drafted in 1947, and it contained something extraordinary. Article 9, in which Japan formally renounced war and the maintenance of offensive military forces, a pacifist clause unlike almost anything else in the world. Land reforms broke up the old feudal landholding system. Labor unions were legalized. Women gained the right to vote. And with security largely guaranteed by the United States under a new alliance, Japan was free to pour nearly everything it had into rebuilding its economy instead of its military. What followed has become one of the most studied economic transformations in modern history. Japanese industry, rebuilt from the ground up with new technology and new methods, began manufacturing cars, electronics, and machinery at staggering efficiency. Companies that are household names today, Toyota, Sony, Honda, Panasonic, either rebuilt or rose to global prominence during this period. If you were a factory worker in Osaka in the 1960s, you were living through what economists would later call the Japanese economic miracle, wages rising year after year, exports flooding into markets around the world. A country that had been reduced to rubble less than 2 decades earlier, now building some of the most reliable cars and electronics on the planet. By 1968, Japan had the second largest economy in the world, a position it would hold for over 4 decades. From atomic ruins to global economic superpower in roughly a single generation, it was the fastest and most complete national reinvention the modern world had ever seen, until perhaps you count what came before it. By the late 1980s, Japan's economic success had inflated into something unsustainable, a massive asset price bubble, with real estate and stock values reaching absurd, unsustainable heights. At the peak, the land underneath the imperial palace in Tokyo was reportedly valued at more than the entire real estate value of the state of California. In 1990 and 1991, that bubble burst. What followed became known as Japan's lost decade, though economists now often extend that label across the 1990s and into the 2000s. Economic growth stagnated. Banks, loaded with bad debt, struggled for years. A generation of young workers entered a job market far weaker than their parents had known. And yet, even through this stagnation, something else was happening. Japan wasn't just an economic story anymore. It was becoming a cultural one. Anime and manga, once a niche domestic industry, exploded into a global phenomenon, shaping entertainment for children and adults on every continent. Japanese video games and gaming consoles defined an entire generation's childhood worldwide. Japanese automotive and electronics brands remained dominant even through economic stagnation. If you grew up almost anywhere in the world in the 1990s or 2000s, some piece of Japan, a cartoon, a video game character, a car, a Walkman, likely shaped your childhood without you ever thinking about where it came from. Japan had proven something unusual. A nation's relevance and influence don't have to rise and fall purely with GDP growth. Soft power, culture, and technology can carry a country's global weight even through economic stagnation. But here's the question worth asking now. Is a third reinvention coming, or has Japan finally hit a wall it cannot rebuild past? Because the challenge facing Japan today isn't a foreign gunship in the harbor or a bombed-out city. It's something quieter and in some ways more difficult to solve. Japan is aging faster and shrinking faster than any other major economy on Earth. Decades of low birth rates have produced a population that is both rapidly graying and rapidly shrinking, with far too few young workers to support a growing elderly population. Rural towns are emptying out. Entire schools have closed simply because there aren't enough children left to fill them. Japan's public debt, as a share of its economy, is among the highest of any developed nation, built up over decades of stimulus spending trying to jolt growth back to life. If you're a young person in Japan today, you're inheriting a country with extraordinary infrastructure, extraordinary technology, and extraordinary cultural influence, alongside a demographic trajectory that no nation in modern history has ever successfully reversed. Immigration, long resisted culturally and politically, has slowly begun to open as a partial answer. Robotics and automation, areas where Japan already leads the world, are being pushed even further as a way to offset a shrinking workforce. Whether these measures amount to a third great reinvention or simply a slower, more manageable decline is genuinely still being written. So what does Japan's story actually teach us? It's tempting to look at this history and see two separate miracles, one after Perry's black ships, one after the atomic bombs. But that framing misses the real lesson. Japan didn't rebuild itself twice because it got lucky twice. It rebuilt itself twice because it treated total collapse as a starting point rather than an ending. In 1868, humiliation became the fuel for the fastest industrialization the world had seen. In 1945, total destruction became the foundation for one of history's most complete economic transformations. Most nations, faced with either of those moments, would have simply broken. Japan, both times, used the moment of maximum vulnerability to rebuild something stronger than what came before. Whether that same instinct can answer a demographic crisis with no historical precedent is a question nobody, including the Japanese government itself, has fully answered yet. But if there's one thing Japan's last 170 years suggest, it's this. Betting against this country's ability to reinvent itself has, historically, been a losing bet.